48, Mother Bear, carried baby. Across Minefield to reach medical help. What she did was beyond heroic. The morning mist hung low over the valley like a soft gray blanket, and everything seemed to be holding its breath. Ethan Marshall adjusted his binoculars for the third time that morning, though nothing about the focus needed changing. He just needed something to do with his hands while he waited. The research station sat perched on a rocky outcrop, giving him and his colleague Lily Morgan a perfect view of the wilderness below. They had been here for 6 months now, studying wildlife patterns, and most mornings started exactly like this one. Coffee getting cold in metal cups, notebooks filled with observations about deer migration patterns and bird nesting behaviors. But this morning felt different somehow. The forest was too quiet. Even the usual morning chorus of birds seemed subdued, as if they too were waiting for something. Lily noticed it first. She always had sharper eyes than Ethan could spot a hawk from twice the distance he could manage. She touched his arm gently, pointing toward the tree line where the forest met the meadow. At first, Ethan saw nothing unusual, just shadows moving between the pines. Then the shape emerged, and his breath caught in his throat. A bear. Not unusual in itself, they had documented dozens of bears over the months. But this one moved differently. She walked with purpose, not the casual ambling gait of a foraging bear, but something more deliberate, more urgent, and she was carrying something. The mother bear emerged fully from the forest, and now they could see clearly what she held. A cub, maybe 4 months old, hung limply from her jaws. The way she carried it, so carefully despite the obvious weight, reminded Ethan of how his own mother had carried him to bed when he pretended to be asleep as a child. The cub wasn't moving. Not a twitch, not a sound. Bears didn't usually carry their cubs like this unless something was very wrong. The mother bear stopped in the middle of the meadow, set the cub down gently, and nuzzled it with her massive head. The cub remained still. She picked it up again and continued walking. Ethan and Lily exchanged glances. In all their combined years of wildlife research, neither had seen anything quite like this. Bears were protective mothers, fierce and devoted, but this behavior was extraordinary. The direction she was heading made no sense either. North of the meadow lay the old valley, a place even humans avoided. During their orientation, they had been warned about it repeatedly. An old minefield from a conflict decades ago, never properly cleared. The locals called it the Quiet Valley because nothing lived there, nothing dared to cross it. Yet the bear continued in that exact direction, her pace never wavering. They watched her for 20 minutes, maybe 30, as she crossed the meadow. Every few hundred yards she would stop, set the cub down and check on it. The ritual was heartbreaking to watch. She would nudge the small body with her nose, make soft sounds that carried across the distance, sounds that needed no translation. They were the sounds of a mother trying to wake her child. Then she would pick the cub up again and continue. Lily had started taking notes, but her handwriting became increasingly shaky. This wasn't just data anymore, this was something else entirely. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, and still the bear continued her journey. She reached the far edge of the meadow where the ground began to slope down toward the valley. This was where most animals turned back. There was an invisible line there, something sensed rather than seen. Deer would approach it and suddenly wheel around. Birds would change direction mid-flight. But the mother bear didn't hesitate. She paused only to adjust her grip on the cub, then began the descent. Ethan grabbed the radio, thinking they should report this to the main research station, but his hand hesitated over the call button. What would he say? That a bear was walking toward certain death? That they were about to witness something terrible? Lily shook her head slightly, understanding his dilemma without words. They had a duty to observe, to document, but not to interfere. That was the first rule of wildlife research. Nature had its own ways, its own reasons, but watching this felt different. This felt like watching someone walk into traffic while you stood frozen on the sidewalk. The bear reached the bottom of the slope, and now she was at the edge of the valley proper. The land here looked deceptively normal. Grass grew in patches. Wildflowers dotted the landscape. If you didn't know the history, you might think it was just another meadow. But Ethan knew. Everyone in the region knew. 30 years ago, this had been a battlefield. When the conflict ended, the armies left, but their deadly seeds remained buried in the soil. The government had put up signs, warning markers in 3 languages, but weather and time had knocked most of them down. Animals couldn't read anyway. What happened next made both researchers doubt their own eyes. The bear stopped at the valley's edge and set her cub down once more. But this time, instead of picking it back up immediately, she did something extraordinary. She began to move forward alone, just a few steps, then stopped. She placed one paw carefully on the ground, testing it, then another. She was feeling her way forward, testing each step before committing her weight. After moving forward about 10 feet, she returned to her cub, picked it up, and followed the exact path she had just tested. Lily's notebook fell from her lap. Neither of them spoke. They couldn't. What they were witnessing defied everything they thought they knew about animal behavior. Bears didn't understand minefields. They couldn't comprehend human weapons buried in soil. Yet this mother was displaying a level of awareness, of careful calculation, that seemed impossible. She repeated the process, set the cub down, moved forward alone, tested the ground, returned, and carried her cub along the safe path she had found. The sun was fully up now, and sweat beaded on Ethan's forehead despite the cool mountain air. He realized he had been holding his breath and forced himself to exhale slowly. Through his binoculars, he could see the bear's face more clearly now. Her eyes weren't wild or frightened. They were focused, determined. She knew exactly what she was doing, even if the humans watching her couldn't understand how or why. Progress was agonizingly slow. What should have been a 10-minute walk across the valley was taking hours. The bear never rushed, never took a careless step. When she reached areas where the ground looked disturbed or uneven, she would test it even more carefully, sometimes backing away and finding another route. Once, she stepped on something that shifted under her weight, and she froze completely for almost a full minute before carefully lifting her paw and backing away. She found another path around that spot. Ethan thought about his grandfather, who had been a soldier in a different war, in a different place. His grandfather had told him stories about walking through minefields, about the terrible tension of each step, never knowing if the next one would be your last. His grandfather had said the worst part wasn't the fear of death, but the slowness of it all. The way time stretched out, how 100 yards could feel like 100 miles. Watching this bear, Ethan finally understood what his grandfather had meant. By noon, the bear had made it halfway across the valley. Lily had filled 3 notebooks with observations, sketches, timestamps, but the clinical documentation felt hollow compared to what they were actually witnessing. This was more than animal behavior. This was something profound, something that spoke to consciousness and awareness in ways their scientific training hadn't prepared them for. The bear continued her methodical progress, and they continued to watch, unable to look away. The cub still hadn't moved, not once. The mother bear's faith that wherever she was going could help her baby was either heartbreaking delusion or knowledge of something the researchers couldn't fathom. Ethan found himself hoping, praying even, though he hadn't prayed since he was a child, that somehow this impossible journey would have meaning, that the bear knew something they didn't, that there was a reason for this extraordinary risk. As the afternoon wore on, clouds began to gather over the mountains. The weather could change quickly here, and a storm would make visibility difficult. But the bear didn't seem concerned about the weather. She had found a rhythm now, a pattern to her movement that was almost hypnotic to watch. Test, return, carry. Test, return, carry. Each cycle brought her a few yards closer to the far side of the valley, to safety, to whatever destination drove her forward. Lily finally broke the silence that had stretched between them for hours. Her voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow disturb the scene below. She wondered aloud if animals could understand death, if they could hope, if they could believe in possibilities beyond their immediate experience. Ethan didn't have answers. His scientific training told him to observe without anthropomorphizing, to resist projecting human emotions onto animal behavior. But watching this mother bear risk everything for her motionless cub, he found his scientific objectivity crumbling. The bear was 3/4 of the way across now. The safe side of the valley was visible, close enough that in normal circumstances, a bear could cover the distance in minutes. But these weren't normal circumstances. Every step still required the same careful process. The mother bear looked tired now. Her movements were slower, her head hanging lower when she walked. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Whatever drove her forward was stronger than exhaustion, stronger than the obvious danger. Then something changed. The bear set her cub down as usual and began to test the path ahead. But this time, she went further than before, moving forward 20, 30 feet. She seemed to be following something, some invisible trail that only she could perceive. Her movements became more confident, though still careful. She was tracking something, following a path that existed in some form she could sense but the humans couldn't see. Ethan remembered something then, something from the orientation briefing that had seemed unimportant at the time. The local guide had mentioned an old story about a shepherd who had lived in the valley before the war. When the conflict came and the mines were laid, the shepherd had supposedly cleared a narrow path to get his flock to safety. He had marked it somehow, in a way only he knew. The path had been lost when the shepherd died, but the story persisted. Local people said animals sometimes knew things, remembered things that humans had forgotten. The bear continued along this invisible path, moving with more purpose now. She would still test the ground, but her tests seemed to confirm something she already expected, rather than searching blindly. She returned to her cub, picked it up with infinite gentleness, and carried it along the path she had verified. The pattern continued, but faster now, more certain. She knew where she was going. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, the bear finally reached the far edge of the valley. She climbed up the slight rise that marked the boundary of the minefield, and for the first time in hours, set her cub down on what was definitively safe ground. Both researchers exhaled simultaneously, not realizing they had been holding their breath again. But the bear's journey wasn't over. Instead of disappearing into the forest on this side of the valley, she picked up her cub once more and began walking along the ridge. The direction she was heading was unmistakable now. She was walking toward the research station. Not the observation post where Ethan and Lily sat, but the main station 2 miles away where the veterinary staff worked. The bear had crossed a minefield, risked everything, to bring her cub to the only place in 50 miles where medical help might be found. The impossibility of it, the sheer audacious hope of it, left both researchers speechless. They watched until the bear disappeared around a bend in the ridge, heading steadily toward the research station. Ethan finally picked up the radio, his hands shaking slightly. He needed to alert the veterinary team, to let them know they were about to have an unusual patient. As he made the call, trying to explain what they had witnessed, he could hear the disbelief in the voice on the other end. But he insisted they prepare, that they watch for her approach. The story of what they had seen would spread, he knew. Other researchers would debate it, analyze it, try to find rational explanations for irrational behavior. They would talk about instinct and coincidence, about anthropomorphism and scientific rigor. But Ethan and Lily would always know what they had really witnessed. They had seen love transcend understanding, had watched hope overcome impossible odds. They had seen a mother bear carry her baby across a minefield, guided by something deeper than instinct, something that defied every scientific explanation they had been taught to believe. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The valley below looked peaceful, almost beautiful in the dying light. You would never know the danger that lurked beneath its serene surface. But somewhere out there, a mother bear was still walking, still carrying her cub, still believing in the possibility of help. And in their observation post, two scientists sat in silence, forever changed by what they had witnessed, by the proof that consciousness and love existed in forms they had never imagined possible. The radio crackled to life an hour later. The veterinary team's voice was different now, no longer skeptical but awed. The bear had arrived. She had walked right up to the station, laid her cub at the door, and stepped back. The cub was alive, barely, suffering from a snake bite that had paralyzed but not killed it. They were treating it now. The mother bear waited nearby, just at the edge of the forest, watching. She had known. Somehow, impossibly, she had known where to bring her baby, had been willing to risk everything to get there. As darkness fell over the mountains, Ethan and Lily packed up their equipment in silence. There would be reports to write, data to analyze, conclusions to draw. But the real conclusion was simpler and more profound than anything they could put in a scientific paper. They had witnessed something that transcended species, that spoke to a deeper connection between all living things. They had seen proof that love and determination could overcome even the most impossible obstacles, that sometimes the heart knows paths the mind cannot understand. The walk back to their quarters was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. The stars were coming out now, brilliant in the clear mountain air. Somewhere in the darkness, a mother bear was keeping vigil over her cub, waiting for it to wake up to return to her. And it would, the veterinary team had assured them. The treatment was working. The paralysis was temporary. By morning, the cub would be moving again, would be reunited with its mother. The impossible journey had not been in vain. That night, neither Ethan nor Lily slept well. Not from distress, but from a kind of excited wonder that made rest impossible. They had been given a glimpse into something usually hidden, had seen evidence of consciousness and awareness in the natural world that went far beyond what they had been taught to expect. The mother bear had shown them that animals were not just bundles of instinct and reaction, but beings capable of hope, planning, and extraordinary courage. The next morning came gray and misty, much like the day before, but everything felt different now. When they returned to their observation post, the valley looked the same, but they saw it differently. It was no longer just a dangerous relic of human conflict, but a testament to the power of maternal love. A mother had crossed it, had found a way through the impossible, because her child needed her to. The story would be told and retold, would become legend perhaps, but for Ethan and Lily, it would always be simply the truth of what they had witnessed. The radio brought news that the cub was recovering well, that mother and baby had been reunited in the early hours of the morning. The veterinary team reported that the mother bear had approached when they brought the cub outside, had sniffed it thoroughly, and then had done something none of them had ever seen. She had looked directly at the humans, held their gaze for a long moment, and then had gently picked up her cub and walked back into the forest. Not rushing, not fearful, but with what could only be described as dignity and perhaps even gratitude. As the days passed, Ethan and Lily continued their research, continued their observations and documentation. But they found themselves looking for the bear and her cub, scanning the tree lines and meadows. 2 weeks later, they saw them. The mother was foraging in a blackberry patch while the cub played nearby, fully recovered, tumbling over logs and chasing butterflies. The mother looked up, seemed to notice the observers on their distant perch, and continued eating. Just a normal bear doing normal bear things. Except both researchers knew better. They had seen her be extraordinary, had witnessed her transcend the limitations that humans imposed on animal consciousness. The official report they filed was clinical, careful, full of qualified statements and scientific hedging. But the truth they carried was simpler and more powerful. They had seen love find a way. They had watched hope navigate an impossible path. They had witnessed a mother bear carry her baby across a minefield to reach help, and in doing so had been given proof that the bonds between parent and child transcend species, that consciousness and awareness exist in forms we are only beginning to understand. The weeks turned to months, and eventually, Ethan and Lily's rotation at the research station came to an end. On their last day, they took one final look at the valley from their observation post. The minefield was still there, still dangerous, still a scar on the landscape. But now it was also something else. It was the place where they had learned that animals could hope, could plan, could love, with a fierce determination that rivaled anything in human experience. It was where they had seen the impossible become possible through the power of a mother's love. As they drove away from the station, heading back to their universities and laboratories, they carried with them a story that would shape the rest of their careers. Not just the data and observations, but the deeper truth of what they had witnessed. They had seen consciousness in its purest form, love without language, hope without words. They had watched a mother bear do what shouldn't have been possible, and in doing so had been reminded that the natural world holds mysteries and wonders that science is only beginning to uncover. The story spread, as such stories do. Other researchers came to study the site, to interview witnesses, to try to understand what had happened. Theories were proposed and debated. Some suggested the bear had followed scent trails, others that it was pure coincidence. But Ethan and Lily knew better. They had seen the careful deliberation, the testing of each step, the purposeful journey toward help. They had witnessed something that transcended scientific explanation, something that spoke to the deeper connections between all living things. Years later, when Ethan was teaching his own students about animal behavior, he would tell them this story. Not as fact necessarily, but as a reminder that consciousness and awareness exist in forms we don't fully understand. That animals are capable of things that surprise us, that challenge our assumptions about intelligence and emotion. He would tell them about the mother bear who carried her cub across a minefield, who somehow knew where to find help, who risked everything for the chance to save her child. And sometimes, late at night in his office, Ethan would think about that day. He would remember the silence that had fallen over the observation post, the way time had seemed to slow down as they watched the bear make her impossible journey. He would think about consciousness and connection, about the mysteries that still existed in the world despite all our scientific knowledge, and he would smile, grateful to have been witness to something extraordinary, to have seen proof that love and determination can overcome even the most impossible obstacles. The research station still stands, still monitors the wildlife in the region. New researchers come and go, collecting data and making observations. The minefield has finally been cleared, the danger removed after all these years. But the story persists. Local guides tell it to visitors, each adding their own details and interpretations. The mother bear and her cub were seen for several more years, living normal bear lives in the forest. The cub grew strong and healthy, eventually setting off on its own as bears do. The mother continued her solitary existence, occasionally spotted by researchers who knew her story. But for those who witnessed it, who saw the actual journey across the valley, the story was more than just an anecdote about unusual animal behavior. It was a reminder that consciousness exists in many forms, that intelligence and emotion are not uniquely human traits. It was proof that the bonds between parent and child are universal, transcending species and defying rational explanation. It was evidence that sometimes love finds a way through the impossible, that hope can navigate the most dangerous paths. The valley is peaceful now, returned to its natural state. Deer graze where mines once lay buried. Birds nest in trees that overlook formerly deadly ground. But for those who know the story, it will always be the place where a mother bear did the impossible, where she carried her dying cub across a minefield, guided by knowledge no one could explain, driven by love that needed no words. It stands as a testament to the mysteries that still exist in our world, to the consciousness that animates all living things, and to the power of a mother's love to overcome any obstacle. In the end, the story raises more questions than it answers. How did the bear know about the minefield? How did she find the safe path? How did she know where to find help? These questions may never have scientific answers, and perhaps that's as it should be. Some things exist beyond the reach of data and analysis. Some truths are felt rather than proven. The mother bear and her cub remind us that the world is full of wonders we don't understand, full of consciousness in forms we're only beginning to recognize. The story becomes part of the folklore of the region, told around campfires and in classrooms. Each telling adds new layers of meaning, new interpretations of what it all meant. But at its core, the story remains simple and powerful. A mother's love found a way. Through danger, through the impossible, through every obstacle, she carried her child to safety. She trusted in something beyond instinct, reached for help across the divide between wild and human, and in doing so, showed us that the connections between all living things are deeper and more mysterious than we often realize. And somewhere in the mountains, in the forests and meadows where bears still roam, the descendants of that mother and cub continue their lives. They don't know their ancestors' story, don't understand their place in the mythology of the region. They simply live, forage, raise their own cubs, and follow the ancient patterns of their kind. But perhaps, in some way that transcends individual memory, they carry within them the knowledge that sometimes the impossible becomes possible, that love can find a way through any danger, and that consciousness connects all living things in ways we are only beginning to understand. The sun sets over the mountains, painting the sky in the same shades of orange and pink that Ethan and Lily saw that day. The research station continues its work, documenting the ordinary miracles of the natural world. And in the quiet moments between observations, researchers sometimes think about the story of the bear and the minefield, about consciousness and connection, about the mysteries that still exist despite all our knowledge. They think about love that transcends understanding, about hope that defies logic, about a mother who did the impossible because the impossible was the only option she had. This is where the story might end, but in truth, it never really ends. It continues in every act of inexplicable courage, in every moment when love overcomes impossible odds. It lives on in the questions it raises about consciousness and intelligence, about the connections between all living things. The mother bear's journey across the minefield becomes a metaphor for all the impossible journeys that love makes possible, for all the times when hope finds a path through danger. The researchers who witnessed it went on to distinguished careers, their work influenced by what they saw that day. They pushed for new understanding of animal consciousness, for recognition of the complex emotional and cognitive lives of the creatures we share this planet with. They never forgot the lesson of the mother bear, that sometimes the heart knows things the mind cannot explain, that love can navigate paths that logic cannot find. And so the story spreads, rippling outward like circles on water. Each person who hears it takes something different from it. Some see evidence of animal intelligence, others proof of divine intervention. Some find hope in the darkest moments of their own lives, remembering that if a bear could cross a minefield for her cub, perhaps they too can find a way through their own impossible situations. The story becomes what each listener needs it to be, while always remaining true to its core. Love finds a way. The minefield is gone now, but the memory remains. The valley has healed, nature reclaiming what was once a place of death. New growth covers old scars. Life flourishes where danger once lurked. It's a reminder that healing is possible, that even the worst human damage can be overcome by the patient persistence of the natural world. And sometimes in the early morning, when mist hangs over the valley, locals say you can still see her, the ghost of a mother bear, carrying her cub, finding her way through the impossible, driven by love that death itself cannot stop. But she's not a ghost. She's a memory, a story, a truth that transcends the facts of what happened. She's every mother who ever faced the impossible for her child. She's every act of courage that defies explanation. She's proof that consciousness and love exist in forms we're only beginning to understand, that the connections between all living things run deeper than we know. She's a reminder that sometimes the most scientific thing we can do is admit that there are mysteries beyond our current understanding. The story will be told differently as years pass. Details will change. Embellishments will be added. But the heart of it will remain. A mother bear carried her dying cub across a minefield to find help. She did what shouldn't have been possible, guided by something beyond instinct, driven by love that needed no words. And in doing so, she showed us something profound about the nature of consciousness, about the bonds that connect all living things, about the power of hope to find a way through the darkest places. This is the legacy of that day, of that impossible journey across a valley of death. It lives on in the work of researchers who now look deeper into animal consciousness. It lives on in the policies that protect wildlife and recognize their cognitive and emotional complexity. It lives on in the hearts of everyone who has heard the story and found in it a reason to hope, a reason to believe that love can overcome any obstacle. The mother bear probably never knew she would become a legend. She was just trying to save her cub, following some deep knowledge that told her where help could be found. She didn't know about the minefield's history, about the human conflicts that had seeded the ground with death. She only knew that her cub needed help, and that there was a place where that help might be found. The rest was just the journey between need and hope, between love and possibility. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, that consciousness doesn't require language to be profound, that love doesn't need words to be powerful, that sometimes the most extraordinary things happen not because someone set out to do something amazing, but because they simply refused to give up on someone they loved. The mother bear's journey across the minefield wasn't about being heroic. It was about being a mother. The heroism was just what happened along the way. As night falls over the mountains once more, as it has every night since that extraordinary day, the world seems full of possibilities. If a bear can cross a minefield, if love can find a way through impossible danger, then what else might be possible? What other connections exist between living things that we haven't yet discovered? What other forms of consciousness and intelligence surround us, unrecognized and unappreciated? The mother bear's journey opened a door to these questions, inviting us to look deeper, to wonder more, to recognize the mysteries that still exist in our thoroughly mapped and studied world. The story ends where it began, with observers watching the natural world and discovering something extraordinary in what seemed ordinary. But now we know to look closer, to question our assumptions about what animals know and feel and understand. We know that consciousness comes in many forms, that intelligence doesn't always look like we expect it to, that love is truly universal. The mother bear taught us this, carrying her cub across a minefield, trusting in something beyond instinct, reaching across the divide between species to find help. And somewhere tonight, in forests and mountains around the world, mother bears are caring for their cubs. They're teaching them to forage, protecting them from danger, loving them with the fierce devotion that defines motherhood across all species. Most will never face a minefield, never need to attempt the impossible. But they all carry within them the same capacity for extraordinary love, the same willingness to risk everything for their children. The mother bear who crossed the minefield wasn't unique in her love, only in the circumstances that revealed it to human eyes. This is the gift of her story, the reminder that we share this world with beings of consciousness and emotion, with creatures capable of love and hope and extraordinary courage. The reminder that the divisions we create between human and animal, between rational and instinctual, are not as clear as we might think. The reminder that sometimes the most profound truths come not from laboratories or lecture halls, but from watching a mother bear do whatever it takes to save her child. The mist will rise again tomorrow over the valley where the minefield used to be. The sun will paint the mountains gold, and life will continue its ancient patterns. But for those who know the story, who understand what happened there, the landscape will always hold a deeper meaning. It will be a place where love conquered fear, where hope found a path through danger, where a mother's determination proved stronger than the deadly legacy of human conflict. It will be holy ground, made sacred not by human hands but by the paws of a bear who wouldn't give up on her cub. And the story continues, passed from person to person, each telling adding new meaning while preserving the essential truth. A mother bear carried her cub across a minefield. She found a way through the impossible. She trusted humans she had every reason to fear. She saved her child through courage and intelligence that defied every expectation. And in doing so, she reminded us all that we are part of something larger than ourselves, connected to all living things through bonds of consciousness and love that transcend the boundaries we think divide us. The research station stands quiet now in the darkness, its work continuing with new generations of scientists. They study migration patterns and feeding behaviors, population dynamics and habitat requirements. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between data points, they remember the story of the bear. They remember that science is not just about facts and figures, but about understanding the profound mysteries of life. They remember that consciousness exists in forms we're only beginning to recognize, that intelligence and emotion are not uniquely human gifts, and that sometimes the most important discoveries come from simply watching and wondering at the extraordinary things that happen when love refuses to accept the impossible. The morning after the bear had delivered her cub to the research station brought with it a strange quality of light, as if the world itself had shifted slightly on its axis. Ethan found himself at the observation post earlier than usual, scanning the valley with his binoculars, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. The minefield looked exactly as it had for years, peaceful and deceptively normal, grass swaying in the morning breeze. But now he knew it differently. Now he knew it as the place where impossible things became possible, where love had found a way through death itself. Lily arrived with coffee and her notebooks, and they settled into their routine of observation, though both knew they were really waiting for something else. They were waiting to understand what they had witnessed, to make sense of the mother bear's impossible knowledge. As the sun climbed higher, Ethan found himself thinking about the path the bear had taken. Not just any path, but a specific route through the minefield that had seemed almost predetermined. The way she had moved with such certainty in those final stretches, as if following something invisible to human eyes but clear to her ancient instincts. It was Lily who first mentioned the old stories. She had been talking to the station's local guide the night before, an elderly man named Thomas who had lived in these mountains all his life. Thomas had told her about his grandfather, who had known the shepherd who once lived in the valley before the war came. The shepherd's name had been Marcus, and he had been famous in the region for his ability to move his flock through the most treacherous terrain without losing a single sheep. When the war came and the mines were laid, Marcus had been forced to abandon his home. But not before he had done something extraordinary. According to Thomas, Marcus had spent 3 days and nights creating a safe path through the minefield. Not to save himself, for he could have simply walked around it, but to save the wild animals who would inevitably try to cross. He had used his shepherd's staff to probe the ground, marking safe spots with stones arranged in patterns only he understood. He had told people that the mountains had been good to him, had given him a life and livelihood, and he couldn't leave without giving something back. The path he created was his gift to the wilderness that had sustained him. But Marcus had been clever about his marking. He knew that obvious markers would be removed or disturbed by weather and time. So he had done something else. Something that sounded impossible when Thomas described it. He had walked the path repeatedly with his sheep, back and forth for hours, letting their scent sink deep into the earth. He had rubbed pine resin and wild herbs along certain trees at the valley's edge, creating scent markers that would last for generations. He believed that animals would sense these old paths, would follow the ghost traces of safety through the danger. Ethan had initially dismissed this as folklore, the kind of story that grows in the telling until it bears no resemblance to truth. But now, sitting at his observation post and remembering the bear's strange certainty in those final moments of her crossing, he wondered if perhaps there was something to it. Animals navigated by scent in ways humans could barely comprehend. They could detect molecular traces that persisted long after any visible sign had vanished. Was it possible that the bear had been following Marcus's ghost path, a trail of safety laid down decades ago by a shepherd who understood something about the connection between humans and animals that modern science was only beginning to grasp? The idea seemed to take root in both their minds simultaneously. They began to discuss it, tentatively at first, then with growing excitement. What if the bear's knowledge wasn't mystical or impossible, but simply a different kind of intelligence, a way of reading the world that humans had lost or never possessed? What if Marcus's path still existed? Not as physical markers, but as a scent trail so faint that only an animal in desperate need, focusing all its attention on finding a way through, could detect it. They decided to investigate further. Using the footage they had captured of the bear's journey, they mapped her exact route through the minefield. Then, with permission from the authorities and accompanied by a military mine-clearing unit, They walked the edges of the valley, looking for any signs of Marcus's markers. At first, they found nothing. The decades had erased any obvious traces, but then Lily noticed something odd about certain trees along the eastern edge. They were older pines, and at about shoulder height. Their bark showed strange patterns of scarring, as if something had been repeatedly rubbed against them long ago. When they brought Thomas to look at the trees, his eyes lit up with recognition. His grandfather had told him about this, about how Marcus would mark his important paths. The shepherd had used a mixture of pine resin and crushed herbs, creating a paste that he would rub into tree bark. The mixture would protect the tree from insects and disease, ensuring it lived longer than its neighbors, becoming a permanent marker that only those who knew how to look would recognize. These trees formed a line pointing directly toward the path the bear had taken. The discovery sent ripples through the scientific community. Here was evidence that traditional knowledge and animal intelligence intersected in ways that challenged conventional understanding. The bear hadn't been following mystical guidance or demonstrating impossible knowledge. She had been reading signs left by a human who understood that someday an animal might need to find its way through the valley of death. Marcus had created not just a path, but a legacy of connection between human and animal worlds. But the story grew even more extraordinary when they investigated further. Thomas remembered more details from his grandfather's stories. Marcus hadn't just marked one path. He had created 3 different routes through the minefield, each for different purposes. One for large animals like bears and deer, another for smaller creatures, and a third that he called the Mother's Path. This last one was the safest but also the longest, winding carefully through areas where the mines had been laid less densely. It was the path a careful parent would take when carrying young. The correlation with the bear's route was undeniable. She had followed the mother's path, the route Marcus had designed specifically for animals carrying their vulnerable young through danger. Somehow, whether through scent markers that persisted beyond human detection, or through some form of inherited knowledge passed down through generations of animals, she had known about this path. She had trusted in the wisdom of a long-dead shepherd who had understood that love and necessity would drive creatures to attempt the impossible. As word of these discoveries spread, other stories began to emerge. Local people remembered their grandparents talking about Marcus, about how he had seemed to communicate with animals in ways that defied explanation. He would whistle certain tunes, and birds would gather around him. He would leave specific herbs at the edges of his pastures, and predators would hunt elsewhere. He had lived in harmony with the wilderness in a way that modern people had forgotten was possible. One elderly woman brought them a photograph, cracked and yellowed with age. It showed Marcus standing with his flock, a tall man with kind eyes and weathered hands. But what caught Ethan's attention was the background of the photo. There, barely visible, was a bear watching from the tree line. The woman said her grandmother had taken the photo and had always insisted that the bear was Marcus's friend, that it would sometimes follow him and his sheep through the mountains, never threatening, just observing. Could it be possible that the mother bear who had crossed the minefield was a descendant of that bear in the photograph? That some form of memory or knowledge had been passed down through generations? A trust in the old shepherd's paths that transcended individual experience? The idea seemed fantastical, but no more so than what they had already witnessed. The intersection of human kindness and animal intelligence had created something that lasted beyond both, a bridge across species and time. The veterinary team at the research station had been working around the clock to save the bear cub. The snake bite had been from a particularly venomous species, and the paralysis it caused was severe. But what amazed them was how the mother bear had kept the cub alive during the journey. She had positioned it carefully when she carried it, ensuring its airway stayed clear. She had stopped regularly to stimulate its breathing with her nose, keeping oxygen flowing to its brain. Her actions showed the understanding of basic life support that seemed impossible for a wild animal to possess. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead veterinarian, had worked with wildlife for 20 years, but she had never seen anything like this. The mother bear had essentially provided primitive emergency care to her cub during the entire journey across the minefield. The cub should have died from the venom, but the mother's constant attention, her careful handling, and perhaps most importantly, her speed in getting to help, had kept it alive just long enough. It was as if she had understood not just that her cub was dying, but approximately how long she had to save it. The treatment was complex, involving anti-venom, supportive care, and careful monitoring. The cub remained paralyzed for 3 days, its small body fighting against the toxin with help from the medical intervention. The mother bear, meanwhile, had taken up residence at the edge of the forest, just visible from the station windows. She never approached too close, never threatened anyone, but she was always there, watching, waiting. The staff began leaving food for her, though she rarely ate it, too focused on watching the building where her cub was being treated. On the 4th day, something changed. The cub's reflexes began to return. First, just a twitch of a paw, then movement in its tail. By evening, it was attempting to lift its head. Dr. Chen called it remarkable, though she knew the word didn't do justice to what she was witnessing. The cub's recovery was fast, faster than any similar case she had treated. It was as if its body had been primed for survival, as if the mother's faith in its recovery had somehow translated into biological reality. When they finally brought the cub outside on the 5th day, still weak but clearly recovering, the mother bear stood up from her waiting spot. She didn't rush forward, didn't charge or threaten. She simply stood and watched as the veterinary team carefully placed the cub on a blanket in the grass, then retreated to the station porch. The mother approached slowly, dignified despite her obvious exhaustion from days of waiting. She sniffed her cub thoroughly, then did something that made everyone watching catch their breath. She looked directly at the humans on the porch, making eye contact with each of them in turn. It wasn't the quick glance of a wild animal checking for threats. It was deliberate, measured, meaningful. Dr. Chen later described it as the most profound moment of interspecies communication she had ever experienced. The bear was acknowledging them, thanking them in the only way she could. Then she gently picked up her cub and began walking back toward the forest. But she stopped once more before disappearing into the trees. She set the cub down and turned back toward the station. For a long moment she simply stood there, as if memorizing the place and the people who had saved her child. Then she picked up the cub again and melted into the forest shadows. The entire staff stood in silence, many with tears in their eyes, understanding they had been part of something extraordinary. In the days that followed, Ethan and Lily continued their research with renewed purpose. They weren't just studying animal behavior anymore. They were documenting evidence of consciousness, intelligence, and emotional complexity that challenged the boundaries between human and animal cognition. The mother bear's journey had opened a door to questions that science was only beginning to know how to ask. They set up camera traps along the routes that Marcus had supposedly marked, and what they found was remarkable. Animals did indeed seem to prefer these paths, even when other routes appeared easier. Deer, foxes, even birds seemed to follow corridors that corresponded to the old shepherd's trails. It was as if he had identified something fundamental about how animals preferred to move through the landscape, and had worked with that understanding rather than against it. But more than that, they began to notice patterns of behavior around these paths that suggested something deeper. Animals would sometimes pause at certain spots, sniffing the air or ground with particular attention. Mothers with young would take these routes more often than solitary animals. Injured or sick animals seemed to find their way to these paths when they needed to travel. It was as if Marcus had created not just safe passages but healing paths, routes that offered some form of comfort or assistance to creatures in need. The scientific implications were staggering. Here was evidence that traditional ecological knowledge, the understanding that indigenous peoples and long-term residents developed through generations of observation and interaction with the land, contained insights that modern science had overlooked. Marcus hadn't been a scientist, but he had understood something about the relationship between humans and animals, about the ways that kindness and wisdom could be embedded in the landscape itself. Thomas, the local guide, became a regular visitor to the observation post. He shared more stories about Marcus and others like him, people who had lived in harmony with the wilderness and left subtle marks of their passage. He talked about women who had planted medicinal herbs along animal trails, knowing that sick animals would find and eat them. He described hunters who would leave portions of their kills in specific places, creating feeding stations that would sustain scavengers through harsh winters. These weren't just acts of kindness, but participation in an ancient dialogue between human and animal worlds. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Thomas told them the most remarkable story of all. Marcus hadn't died in the war, as many assumed. He had lived for many years after, but he had never returned to the valley. The minefield had broken his heart. The idea that his beloved landscape had been turned into a weapon. But before he died, he had done one last thing. He had walked the perimeter of the valley with his last remaining sheep, an old ewe who had been with him since the beginning. Together, they had traced the safe paths one final time, reinforcing the scent trails that might one day guide an animal to safety. The ewe had lived for several years after Marcus died, cared for by Thomas's family. She would sometimes wander off and stand at the edge of the valley, looking across the minefield as if waiting for something. Thomas's grandfather had thought she was senile, but now Thomas wondered if she had been maintaining Marcus's work, keeping the scent markers fresh, ensuring the paths remained findable. Animals, he suggested, might have their own ways of preserving important knowledge, their own methods of passing on crucial information across generations. The mother bear and her cub were seen regularly over the following weeks. The cub had recovered completely, showing no signs of its near-death experience. It played and explored with the boundless energy of youth, while its mother foraged and watched with the patient attention of motherhood. But sometimes, Ethan and Lily noticed, the mother would pause and look toward the research station, or toward the valley she had crossed. Not with fear or anxiety, but with something that looked like remembrance. They began to wonder about animal memory, about how experiences were encoded and transmitted. Did the cub carry any memory of its journey across the minefield, of the humans who had saved its life? Would it someday, if faced with its own impossible situation, remember that there was a place where help could be found? Or would the memory fade, leaving only a vague sense of trust, a feeling that sometimes the impossible becomes possible? Dr. Chen had taken blood samples from the cub during treatment, and the analysis revealed something interesting. The stress hormones that should have been extremely elevated were surprisingly low. Despite the trauma of the snakebite and the journey, the cub's body showed signs of having been in a protected state, as if the mother's presence had somehow buffered it from the worst of the physiological stress. It was another piece of evidence that the bonds between parent and child involved more than just physical protection, that love itself might have measurable biological effects. The research station began a new project, studying the paths that Marcus had created and documenting the animals that used them. They found that certain species seemed to have designated leaders who knew the paths best, older individuals who would guide others through dangerous areas. It was a form of cultural transmission, knowledge passed not through genes, but through teaching and example. The wilderness, they were learning, was full of wisdom that existed outside human understanding. Intelligence that didn't look like human intelligence, but was no less real or important. One morning, about a month after the incident, something extraordinary happened. A female deer appeared at the edge of the valley with a badly injured fawn. The fawn had been caught in old barbed wire, its leg deeply cut and infected. The doe stood at the exact spot where the bear had begun her journey, looking across the minefield toward the research station. She made no attempt to cross, perhaps understanding that the danger was too great, or perhaps simply not possessing the same desperate determination that had driven the bear, but she didn't leave either. She stood there for hours, calling out periodically, her cries carrying across the valley to the station. It was Lily who first understood what was happening. The deer knew about the bear, about the help that existed on the other side of the valley. She was asking for the same assistance, the same miracle. The story of the mother bear had somehow spread through the animal community, becoming part of their collective understanding of the world. The veterinary team couldn't ignore the plea. They drove around the valley, a journey of several hours, and found the doe still waiting with her fawn. The doe retreated when they approached, but not far, watching as they examined and treated her injured offspring. The fawn was sedated, the wound cleaned and bandaged, antibiotics administered. When they stepped back, the doe approached cautiously, sniffed her fawn, and waited for it to wake up. Once it did, she led it away, but not before pausing to look back at the humans who had helped. This began a pattern that continued for months. Animals would appear at the edges of the valley, some injured, some sick, some simply in need. Not all of them, and not often, but regularly enough that it couldn't be coincidence. The research station had become something unprecedented, a place where wild animals came for help, where the boundary between human and animal worlds had become permeable. It wasn't a Disney movie fantasy of talking animals and perfect understanding. It was messier, more complex, more real. It was recognition that consciousness and intelligence existed in many forms, and that kindness could transcend species boundaries. The scientific papers that Ethan and Lily published about their observations were met with skepticism at first. The idea that animals could possess and transmit complex knowledge about human medical assistance seemed too anthropomorphic, too much like wishful thinking. But the evidence was hard to dismiss. The documented cases, the video footage, the patterns of behavior that couldn't be explained by simple conditioning or instinct. Slowly, the scientific community began to accept that something remarkable was happening in those mountains. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the local community. The story of the mother bear had revived interest in the old ways of living with nature. Young people began asking their grandparents about traditional knowledge, about the stories and practices that had been dismissed as superstition. They learned about reading animal signs, about the reciprocal relationships that had once existed between humans and wildlife. Marcus became a folk hero, his wisdom recognized decades after his death. Thomas started leading walks to the edge of the valley, teaching people about Marcus's paths and the old ways of understanding nature. He would point out the marked trees, explain the patterns of animal movement, share the stories that connected past and present. The minefield, once a symbol of human destruction, became a classroom for learning about connection and coexistence. The danger was still there, the mines still buried and deadly, but meaning had been layered over destruction. One day, nearly 6 months after the original incident, Ethan and Lily were at their observation post, when they saw something that stopped them both mid-conversation. The mother bear was back at the edge of the valley, but this time she wasn't alone. She had 2 new cubs with her, tiny bundles of fur that couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, and walking beside her, now fully grown and healthy, was the cub she had carried across the minefield. The family group moved along the valley's edge, the mother showing her cubs the boundaries of the dangerous area. She would nose them back when they wandered too close, teaching them the lessons that would keep them safe. But then she did something extraordinary. She led them to one of Marcus's marked trees, the old pines with the scarred bark. She stood up against the tree and rubbed her back against it, leaving her scent on the ancient marker. Then she encouraged her cubs to do the same, pushing them gently toward the tree until they too rubbed against it. She was teaching them about the paths, passing on the knowledge that had saved their sibling's life. She was ensuring that the next generation would know about Marcus's gift, about the safe ways through danger. It was cultural transmission in its purest form, wisdom passed from mother to child, connecting past and future through the present moment. Ethan and Lily watched in silent awe, understanding they were witnessing something that no scientific journal would ever fully capture. As the months turned to years, the story of the mother bear became legend, but a legend grounded in documented fact. The research station continued its work, building on the foundation of that extraordinary day. They discovered more about animal intelligence, about the ways that different species communicated and cooperated. They found evidence of complex social structures, of teaching and learning, of culture and tradition in the animal world. But more than that, they discovered something about the nature of consciousness itself. It wasn't limited to humans, wasn't defined by language or technology. Consciousness was the awareness that connected all living things, the recognition of self and other, the capacity for love and fear and hope. The mother bear had shown them that consciousness could navigate impossible dangers, could reach across species boundaries, could find help in the most unlikely places. The valley was eventually cleared of mines, a massive undertaking that took years to complete. When it was finally safe, they erected a monument at the spot where the bear had begun her journey. It wasn't a grand statue or elaborate memorial, just a simple stone marker with an inscription, "Here, love found a way." But people knew the story, knew what those words meant. They came from around the world to stand at that spot, to look across the now safe valley, to think about consciousness and connection and the courage of a mother who wouldn't give up. The mother bear lived for many more years, raising multiple generations of cubs. Each time she had new offspring, she would bring them to the marked trees, teaching them about the paths. Other bears began to do the same, and the trees became gathering points, places where information was exchanged through scent and observation. The animal community had incorporated Marcus's paths into their own cultural knowledge, making his gift permanent in ways he could never have imagined. Dr. Chen established a wildlife rehabilitation center near the research station, a place where injured animals could receive care without losing their wildness. It operated on principles learned from the mother bear incident: minimal intervention, respect for animal intelligence, and recognition that healing involved more than just medical treatment. The center became a model for others around the world, showing that humans and wildlife could coexist in ways that benefited both. Ethan and Lily continued their research for many years, their work fundamentally changing how science understood animal consciousness. They never stopped learning from the animals they observed, never stopped being surprised by the intelligence and awareness they discovered. But they always came back to the story of the mother bear, to that impossible journey across the minefield. It remained the touchstone of their work, the reminder that science was about more than data and theories. It was about recognizing the mystery and wonder in the world around us. The local community transformed as well. The story of the mother bear and Marcus's paths had reconnected them with their landscape, with the old ways of knowing and being. Children grew up understanding that they were part of a larger community that included all living things. They learned to read animal signs, to respect the intelligence of other species, to see themselves as participants in an ancient dialogue between human and more than human worlds. Schools began teaching about traditional ecological knowledge alongside modern science, recognizing that both ways of understanding had value. Marcus's story became part of the curriculum, not as myth but as history, as an example of how one person's wisdom and kindness could ripple through time. Students would visit the marked trees, now protected as historical sites, and learn about the shepherd who had understood something profound about the connection between all living things. The mother bear's grown cub, the one she had saved, became known to researchers as Marcus, named after the shepherd whose paths had made the rescue possible. Marcus the bear grew to be large and strong, but he carried something unusual for a wild bear, a tolerance for human presence that went beyond mere habituation. He would sometimes appear near the research station, not seeking food or attention, just observing. It was as if he remembered, on some level, the kindness that had saved his life. Marcus the bear had his own cubs eventually, and researchers noticed something remarkable. He would bring them near the station, not close enough to be dangerous, but close enough to see. He would sit with them at the forest edge, watching the humans go about their work. Was he teaching them that humans could be trusted? Was he passing on some memory of rescue and healing? Or was it simply coincidence, a behavior that meant nothing more than an animal happening to rest in a familiar spot? The questions multiplied faster than the answers, which was perhaps as it should be. The mother bear's journey had opened doors to mysteries that might never be fully solved, but that was part of its gift. It reminded humans that the world was still full of wonders, that consciousness and intelligence existed in forms we were only beginning to recognize, that the boundaries we drew between ourselves and other species were more fluid than we had imagined. Years later, when Ethan was retired and writing his memoirs, he would struggle to capture what that day had meant. How could words convey the silence that had fallen as they watched the bear test each step? How could he explain the feeling of witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world? In the end, he wrote simply about love and courage, about a mother who had done the impossible because the impossible was all she had. Lily established a foundation dedicated to studying and preserving traditional ecological knowledge. She traveled the world, documenting the wisdom of people who had lived in harmony with nature for generations. Everywhere she went, she found versions of Marcus's story. People who had understood that humans and animals were part of the same community, who had left gifts of knowledge and kindness for future generations of all species. The foundation funded research into animal intelligence and consciousness, supporting young scientists who were willing to ask difficult questions about the nature of awareness and cognition. They studied everything from the problem-solving abilities of crows to the emotional lives of elephants, building a picture of consciousness as something that existed on a spectrum rather than as a binary state. The mother bear had shown them that intelligence came in many forms, and they were determined to recognize and respect them all. The cleared valley became a nature reserve, a place where Marcus's paths were preserved and studied. Walking trails were established that followed the safe routes he had marked, allowing people to experience the landscape as animals did. Interpretive signs told the story of the shepherd and the bear, of the connection between human kindness and animal intelligence. It became a pilgrimage site of sorts, a place where people came to think about their relationship with the natural world, But the most lasting impact was on the philosophy of conservation itself. The mother bear's story had shown that protecting wildlife wasn't just about preserving species or maintaining ecosystems. It was about recognizing the consciousness and intelligence of other beings, about understanding that we shared the world with creatures capable of love, hope, and courage. Conservation became less about managing resources and more about fostering relationships, less about control and more about coexistence. The research station expanded, becoming a center for the study of interspecies communication and cooperation. Scientists from around the world came to learn about the methods developed there, about ways of studying animals that respected their intelligence and agency. The old model of detached observation gave way to something more like conversation, a recognition that understanding animal consciousness required acknowledging that animals were subjects, not just objects of study. New technologies were developed to better understand how animals perceived and navigated their world. Scent mapping tools revealed the invisible trails that crisscrossed the landscape, the chemical highways that animals used to share information. Advanced audio equipment captured communications below and above human hearing range, revealing complex conversations that had always been happening around us. Each discovery reinforced what the mother bear had shown, that animal intelligence was real, complex, and deserving of respect. The story spread beyond scientific circles, inspiring artists, writers, and filmmakers. But unlike the anthropomorphized animals of children's stories, these creative works tried to capture something more authentic, the reality of animal consciousness that was different from human consciousness but no less valid. They explored what it might feel like to navigate by scent, to communicate through body language, to experience the world through senses humans didn't possess. Children who grew up hearing the story of the mother bear developed a different relationship with nature. They didn't see animals as cute but lesser beings, or as resources to be managed. They understood that they were surrounded by other forms of consciousness, other ways of being in the world. This shift in perspective, multiplied across generations, began to change how humanity related to the rest of the living world. The mother bear herself lived to be very old for a wild bear, finally passing away peacefully in her sleep one autumn day. Researchers found her body in a small grove of trees not far from where she had first emerged with her dying cub all those years ago. She was surrounded by the scent markings of many bears, as if they had come to pay their respects. It was probably just coincidence, the random overlap of territorial markings, but it felt like something more. They buried her near Marcus's marked trees, in a spot where wildflowers bloomed every spring. No marker was placed, no monument erected. She belonged to the wilderness, and the wilderness would remember her in its own way. But every researcher who had known her story, every person who had been touched by her journey, carried a piece of her memory forward. She had changed how they saw the world, had proven that love and consciousness existed in forms they were only beginning to understand. The cub she had saved, Marcus the bear, lived for many years after his mother's death. He became something of a guardian of the valley, often seen near the old Minefield area as if keeping watch. When the mines were finally cleared and the land was safe, he was one of the first animals to cross the valley freely, walking the path his mother had carried him along so many years before. Researchers watched him make that journey, saw him pause at certain spots, as if remembering, though they knew memory in bears didn't work the way human memory did. Or did it? That question, like so many raised by the mother bear's story, remained open. And perhaps that was the most important legacy of all. She had reminded humanity that the world was still full of mysteries, that consciousness and intelligence existed in forms we didn't fully understand, that the boundaries between human and animal, between self and other were more fluid than we had imagined. She had shown that love could transcend species, that courage could overcome impossible odds, that sometimes the heart knew things the mind couldn't explain. The research station still operates today, still studies the wildlife of the region. New generations of scientists continue the work that Ethan and Lily began, building on their foundations while asking new questions. They use more advanced technology, have access to more sophisticated theories of consciousness and cognition, but they all know the story of the mother bear, all understand that their work began with a moment of impossible courage, with a mother's love that found a way through a minefield. And sometimes, on misty mornings when the light falls just right, people say you can still see her. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but something more like a memory embedded in the landscape itself. The shadow of a bear carrying her cub, moving carefully but determinedly through danger, guided by love and ancient wisdom. It's probably just a trick of the light, the way the mist moves through the valley. But those who have heard the story know better. They know that some truths transcend the physical, that consciousness leaves marks on the world that can't be measured or photographed, but are no less real. The valley is peaceful now, healed from its wounds. Where minds once lay buried, wildflowers bloom. Where death once waited hidden, life flourishes. The paths that Marcus marked are still there, worn deeper now by generations of animals who have followed them. Trees he marked still stand, ancient now, their scarred bark telling stories to those who know how to read them. The landscape holds memory in ways that science is only beginning to understand, preserving wisdom that transcends individual lives. New stories emerge from the research station regularly. A fox that led researchers to an injured owl, a deer that seemed to understand when hunting season began and would move her fawns to safety near the station. Ravens that would alert the staff to animals in distress. Each story adds another layer to the understanding that began with the mother bear, that consciousness connects all living things, that intelligence takes many forms, that the world is full of awareness we're only beginning to perceive. But none of these stories quite match the original. There was something about that mother bear, about her desperate journey across the minefield, that captured a fundamental truth about consciousness and love. She had shown that the impossible became possible when driven by love, that intelligence could manifest in ways that defied human understanding, that the boundaries between species were conventions, not absolute truths. The impact rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. Wildlife conservation laws were rewritten to acknowledge animal consciousness and intelligence. Veterinary practices evolved to recognize that healing involved more than just treating physical symptoms. Educational curricula were redesigned to teach children about the many forms of intelligence in the natural world. The mother bear had changed not just how we understood animals, but how we understood consciousness itself. Philosophy departments at universities began offering courses on non-human consciousness, exploring questions that had once been dismissed as unscientific. What did it mean to be aware? Could consciousness exist without language? How did different forms of consciousness experience the world? The mother bear's story became a touchstone for these discussions, a real-world example that challenged theoretical assumptions. Meanwhile, in the mountains where it all began, life continued its ancient patterns. Bears foraged and raised their cubs. Deer followed their migration routes. Birds sang their territorial songs. But there was something different now, a quality of attention, of mutual awareness. The animals knew they were seen differently, understood differently, and perhaps they too saw humans differently, understood that sometimes, across the vast divide of species difference, connection was possible. The research station received a gift one spring, 20 years after the original incident. A young woman arrived, introducing herself as Marcus's great-great-granddaughter. She had been researching her family history and had discovered the connection between her ancestor and the famous bear story. She brought with her something remarkable. Marcus's journal, discovered in an old trunk in her grandmother's attic. The journal was written in faded ink, the pages brittle with age, but the words were still readable. In it, Marcus had documented his creation of the paths through the Minefield. But more than that, he had written about his philosophy of living with nature, about the conversations he believed he had with animals, about the responsibility humans had to use their unique abilities to help other species. One passage stood out. "The bears know things we have forgotten. They remember the world before our boundaries, before our wars. When I mark these paths, I am not teaching them something new. I am reminding them of something old, something that connects us all. Someday, when I am gone, and even these marks have faded, the knowledge will remain. It will live in the landscape itself, in the memory of stone and tree and earth. And when an animal needs to find its way through danger, that knowledge will be there, waiting. This is my gift to them, payment for all they have taught me about being truly alive in this world." The journal transformed the understanding of what had happened. Marcus hadn't just marked physical paths. He had somehow encoded knowledge into the landscape itself, had found a way to make wisdom permanent. The mother bear hadn't just followed scent trails. She had accessed a kind of library written in the language of the land, a repository of knowledge that transcended individual memory. This discovery led to new research into how landscapes hold memory, how information could be encoded in ways that persisted across generations. Scientists studied the chemical signatures of Marcus's marked trees, finding complex compounds that seemed to trigger specific behaviors in animals. They discovered that certain combinations of scents could convey surprisingly complex information, that animals could read these chemical messages in ways that resembled how humans read written words. But even as science advanced its understanding, the mystery deepened. The more they learned about animal consciousness and landscape memory, the more questions arose. How did the mother bear know to trust the path? How did she understand that humans could provide medical help? How did her story spread through the animal community, becoming part of their collective knowledge? Each answer revealed new puzzles, new wonders. The woman who had brought Marcus's journal decided to stay in the area, to learn more about her ancestor and his connection to the land. She became a bridge between the old knowledge and the new, helping to translate traditional wisdom into terms that modern science could engage with. She would take researchers to places Marcus had written about, showing them subtle signs in the landscape that revealed ancient patterns of movement and connection. Through her, they learned that Marcus had not been unique. Throughout the mountains there had been others like him, people who had lived in deep relationship with the land and its creatures. They had left their own marks, their own gifts of knowledge. The landscape was layered with wisdom, generations of human understanding woven into the fabric of the natural world. The mother bear's story was just one thread in a tapestry that stretched back to the beginning of human consciousness. As the years passed, the story of the mother bear became myth, but myth in the deepest sense, a truth too large for facts alone to contain. It was told in different ways by different people, each version highlighting different aspects of the mystery. Scientists focused on the evidence of animal intelligence. Philosophers explored the implications for consciousness studies. Artists found inspiration in the image of love conquering impossible obstacles. Children simply loved the story of the brave mama bear who saved her baby. But at its heart, the story remained simple and powerful. A mother's love had found a way through danger. Intelligence had manifested in unexpected forms. connection had transcended the boundaries between species. The impossible had become possible through the combination of ancient wisdom, animal consciousness, and human compassion. It was a story that reminded people that the world was full of wonders, that consciousness existed in many forms, and that love was the force that connected all living things. The research station became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the deeper mysteries of consciousness and connection. People came from around the world to walk the paths Marcus had marked, to stand where the mother bear had begun her journey, to think about what it all meant. Some found scientific insights. Others found spiritual meaning. All found themselves changed by the encounter with a story that challenged their assumptions about the nature of intelligence and awareness. And in the forests and mountains, life continued. New generations of bears were born, raised, and taught the wisdom of their ancestors. Among that wisdom, encoded in scent and behavior, in the patterns of movement across the landscape, was the knowledge of the paths through danger, the memory of the mother who had done the impossible, the understanding that sometimes, when all seems lost, love finds a way. The story never really ends. It continues in every act of cross-species kindness, in every moment when humans and animals recognize each other as conscious beings worthy of respect. It lives on in the research that expands our understanding of intelligence and awareness. It persists in the landscape itself, in the marked trees and worn paths that remember what we have forgotten. The mother bear's journey across the minefield was just one chapter in an ancient story about the connections that bind all living things. Today, if you visit the valley, you can walk the paths that Marcus marked and the mother bear followed. You can touch the old trees with their scarred bark, feeling the texture of ancient wisdom. You can stand at the spot where she began her journey, looking across what was once a deadly minefield and is now a meadow full of life. And if you're very quiet, if you pay attention with more than just your eyes and ears, you might sense something. The presence of consciousness in forms you don't fully understand, the echo of courage that transcended species, the memory of love that found a way through the impossible. The mother bear taught us that consciousness isn't limited to humans, that intelligence takes many forms, that love is universal. She showed us that the boundaries we create between ourselves and other species are illusions, that we're all part of something larger, connected in ways we're only beginning to understand. Her journey across the minefield was a bridge between worlds, a proof that communication and cooperation are possible across the vast differences that seem to separate us. And perhaps most importantly, she reminded us that the world is still full of mysteries. Despite all our science and technology, despite our maps and measurements, there are still wonders we don't understand. Consciousness remains the great mystery, the phenomenon that connects all living things while manifesting in countless unique forms. The mother bear's story is a reminder to approach that mystery with humility and wonder, to recognize that other beings have their own ways of knowing and being that are as valid as our own. The sun sets over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The research station settles into evening routines. In the forests, animals follow paths worn by generations of travelers, some marked by human kindness, others by ancient instinct. And somewhere, in the intersection between wild and human worlds, the story continues. New chapters are being written by every act of recognition, every moment of connection, every time someone looks at an animal and sees not an object, but another conscious being navigating the world in their own unique way. This is the legacy of the mother bear, the understanding that we are not alone in consciousness, that intelligence and love exist throughout the living world, that the impossible becomes possible when we recognize our connections to all life. Her journey across the minefield was never just about one bear saving one cub. It was about all of us, about the bridges we can build between worlds when we approach each other with respect and wonder. It was about the ancient wisdom that persists in landscape and memory, waiting to guide us through our own minefields. It was about love that transcends understanding, consciousness that defies categories, and connections that bind all living things in an infinite web of awareness and possibility.